Chapter 18. Back Together. Max knew his granddaughter was in good hands. Asmith was the person most capable of fixing the Omnitrix. There was no question of that. It was hard, though, not knowing what was happening with her. So he was glad that when the lights flashed and the figures resolved, she was there, standing tall again, eyes back to normal. He stepped forward and hugged her. "Don't do that to me again, kiddo." She grinned and handed Asmith over to him. "I'll do my best. Have you seen Rook?" "Mess hall." Jen nodded and hugged her grandfather again. "Love you, kiddo." "Love you too, Grandpa." She left, and Max turned to Asmith. The Galvin was frowning. "We may have a problem." Max nodded. "Do we know if Malware is still alive?" Asmith shook his head. "As far as I knew, he died the day he destroyed her conductoid form. But if he did manage to reform, he is far more powerful of a threat now than he ever was. If he had a hand in creating this Nematrix, then we may be facing a threat unlike those we've seen before." Max nodded. He didn't want his granddaughter going up against that being again. He still had nightmares about her screaming when feedback was ripped away from her. "We'll keep a close eye on her." Asmith nodded and tapped his teleporter and vanished. Max shook his head and flinched as his phone began to buzz. He pulled it out and answered the call. "Gwen?" "Hey, Grandpa, Kevin and I are coming into town for the weekend. We wanted to drop in and see how everything's going." Max smiled slightly. "You could not have picked a better time, Pumpkin." Rook frowned as he refilled his tea. He was getting quite tired. He would have to head to bed soon. He had hoped Jen would be back before he had to turn in for the night. Someone stepped up next to him, and he spotted the familiar green stripe on black. He turned, and Jen smiled as she poured herself a cup of tea as well. She smiled at him, and he felt the gnawing worry ease. He smiled and sipped his tea. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged. "Better, I guess? You want to talk about what happened?" Rook nodded. "If you would not mind, I am having some problems processing what happened." Jen nodded. "Come on, you have more tea at your place?" He nodded. "Good, we'll go there." She led the way to the Ravana-Gander's quarters. He unlocked the door and set about making a fresh pot of tea. They were silent while he worked. He set the tray down in front of her on the table and sat down with a deep breath. "Is that what it always feels like when you transform?" A slight smile pulled at the corners of her lips. "Like I told you before, they all feel different. Who'd you get mixed with?" Rook blinked. "You do not remember?" "Not a damn thing, though that's not all that unusual." She sighed. "A while back, the Omnitrix got damaged by an assassin named 66. He hit the dial with a laser blast before I could transform. A few of my transformations escaped, and the blowback of power mutated Kevin. Again. Nearly permanently, he only went back to normal when the original Omnitrix was destroyed." Rook nodded. "I was fused with your Gourmand transformation when I attempted to catch you after the cerebrocrustation dropped you." "Thanks for trying to catch me." Rook nodded. "You are my partner. If I can help, I will." She grinned. "I appreciate it. Upchuck's always been a little weird. There's only one sample in the Omnitrix, but it's not always the same. There are two kinds of gourmands, mercs and perks. I'm not sure why they don't register as two DNA samples since there's technically a genetic mutation between them." She shrugged. "That one's always felt a little like getting remolded into something smaller." Rook looked relieved. "I was unsure if it would just be how I felt it." Jen sipped her tea, deep in thought for a moment. "You know, I never really talked to anyone about how it feels before. Not anyone who would get it, anyway. My cousin asked about it once, but it freaked her out." Rook frowned. "Did you not talk about it with your fiancé?" Jen got a bit of a nostalgic smile. No, not really. I was always worried that I was too much for him, that my crazy lifestyle would drive him away. She shook her head. It never did, though. She sighed into her tea. What else did I miss? Rook took his time explaining what had happened. Jen frowned, whistling. That's never done the code lines in red before. I bet that was creepy. Rook shook his head. If you had not looked so, pardon my bluntness, dead, it would not have been as bad. Jen nodded. Being blunt isn't a bad thing. A lot of the time, anyway. There are moments when it's not so great. Rook nodded. But you are well now. She nodded. Yeah, but we may have other problems. Asma thinks that Dr. Psychobos, the cerebrocrustacean, who took a piece of the Omnitrix, built the Nematrix. So we may be seeing Kyber again soon. Rook nodded. We will be ready. Jen smiled and drank the last of her tea. That's the kind of answer I like to hear. Listen, I need to head home, check in with my parents. I'll meet you at Mr. Smoothie's tomorrow for pre-patrol smoothies. My treat. Rook smiled. That sounds good. Jen nodded and stood, heading for the door. Jen, she paused. I am glad you are unharmed. Her smile softened. You too, Rook. With that, she left, leaving Rook alone with his tea and his confusing feelings. Jen did not make it all the way home, stopped by a blazing fire to rush in and save a little girl. Wrath hadn't been the alien she'd meant to pick, but she was always a fun one, even if the little girl liked Brainstorm better. She snorted at Gwen and Kevin as she transformed back to normal. She placed hands on both their shoulders. It's good to see you two. The trio hugged, then raced off to Gwen's house, Jen following Kevin's car on her bike. Gwen had been briefed on what had happened earlier and insisted that Jen head home and get some sleep. They could catch up tomorrow. Kevin, though, looked a bit twitchy and left Gwen's house to head to his mom's and check on her. Jen shook her head, but she was still pretty tired, and put it down to Kevin's usual paranoia, which was almost on par with hers. She fell asleep that night and dreamed of amber eyes and the green glass of the Genesis cradle. Chapter 19, Problematic. Jen would admit that Kevin was acting a little weird, but she'd never expected a war-hungry Tetraman fiancé was the reason for that. Nor did she realize that beating Luma in a fight meant not just nullifying her engagement to Kevin, but getting herself stuck in that same position. Apparently on Koros, they were accepting of any relationship as long as one was stronger than the other. Heirs could be made other ways, as she was assured by her apparently soon-to-be father-in-law. By the time Jen managed to gather her thoughts, Kevin had fled, Gwen glaring daggers at him as they went. Luma waved from her father's side. "Good battle, love," she called out flirtatiously. Her father nodded. "Good battle, Jen." Jen could think of nothing else to do, so she waved and nodded. Yeah, good battle. The Tetramans left, taking their fleet with them. Jen let her hand drop to her side. "I'm going to murder Kevin," she stated matter-of-factly as she turned to Rook. He frowned. "Is that, just an Earth saying?" Jen sighed. "Sort of. I haven't decided if I want it to be literal or not yet. Gwen might finish him off for me." She shook her head as they made their way back to the proto-truck. It took them a while to get to it, and Jen seemed to still be steaming with rage, so Rook kept silent. When they reached the truck, Jen strapped into her seat and sighed loudly. "Sorry, I'm very angry at Kevin. Not you. I need to talk to Grandpa Max and figure out a way to fix this." Rook nodded. "It is understandable. I cannot think of anyone who would want to be engaged to someone they do not love." Jen nodded. Kevin's car was full of sullen silence. Gwen was glaring holes into the side of his head. He wasn't sure what to say. But after about an hour of this, he broke.
Look, I'm sorry. I should have told you.
Yeah.
I was wrong not to.
Yeah. Her tone was cold, and she was still glaring at him. He sighed and pulled over. He turned to her. Green eyes were glaring daggers at him, and he flinched slightly.
Is yeah all you're gonna say?
Gwen let out an angry breath from her nose. Why didn't you tell me? Kevin flinched slightly, then sighed.
I was ashamed. It's not something I'm super proud of. I was young. I regretted it pretty immediately, but there wasn't a way out of it without someone else beating Luma. I sort of hoped that had already happened when I didn't hear from her in 3 years.
Gwen nodded, still glaring. So you decided that tricking my cousin into beating Luma instead was a good plan. Her tone was so cold he had to shiver.
That was sort of spur of the moment. Wasn't really thinking about long term, just about not getting married in front of the girl I love when it's not to the girl I love.
Gwen blinked. Silence reigned. You'd want to get married to me? Her question was quiet. He blinked, going bright red as he realized what he'd said.
Well, yeah, I love you.
Gwen had gone pink, and her glare had softened. You're still in the doghouse, though. Kevin nodded.
Fair. But your cousin is clever. She'll find a way out of it.
Gwen nodded as Kevin pulled the car back out onto the road. Well, you're right about that. She is clever. I'm sure Rook would be willing to help her out. Kevin laughed.
Oh, he's smitten. He'll be more than happy to help.
Gwen grinned. I'm glad I'm not the only one who saw it. The two of them laughed as they drove back towards Gwen's school. Max shook his head. How was it that his granddaughter always managed to get into scrapes like this? He was currently researching the ins and outs of Tetramand marriage rituals, the engagement rituals specifically. There was a lot about fighting and maiming in it. Generally, a female Tetramand was pledged to the male who beat her in a fight, though a female could defeat another and gain their hand in marriage, or a male could defeat another male and win the same. Jen rolled her eyes from her spot across from them. Rook was quietly reading next to her. It's actually kind of interesting. Max raised an eyebrow at his granddaughter. She shrugged. What? I don't get to study the cultures of my aliens often. It's usually just punching, which admittedly seems to be a good bit of the Tetramand culture. Max laughed.
Well, at least we got a few years to figure it out.
Jen nodded. Yeah. Rook finally piped up.
There does not seem to be much precedent for interspecies relationships in this traditional mating ceremony.
Jen leaned over to look at what Rook was reading. Maybe that could be a precedent for getting me out of it. Max shook his head.
Not really.
Max said, passing a few pieces of paper to them. They detailed a few examples of the same traditional mating ritual between both a Tetramand male and a female Florana, and one between a female Tetramand and a male Apoplexian. Jen frowned. I mean, progressive, yay, but damn, no easy out. Max laughed lightly at Rook, as Rook shook his head. Jen rubbed her forehead. I need food. You want to come with, Rook? He nodded and stood. Max collected the papers they'd already gone through.
I'll run this past legal, see if they can't find a loophole we missed.
Jen raised an eyebrow. We have a legal department? Rook nodded.
Yes, we do. We have many departments, including in human resources.
Huh. Neat. They left as Max gathered up the last of his papers. He shook his head. The two of them got into more scrapes together than he'd ever gotten into in his days in the field. But at least they had each other's backs.